In today's episode, we are going to talk about the world's most expensive food, which is not actually a food at all, but an ingredient called abalone, and we will try to answer the question, why is it so expensive? In order to understand why this ingredient can cost more than $200 per pound, we first need to go back in history and see how humans have interacted with abalones throughout time. The first records that we have of people consuming abalones date back to prehistoric times. Archaeologists found evidence of people eating them in what is now Scotland, France and Spain, dating back as far as 8,000 years ago. People ate them in those days by simply boiling them whole, either in hot springs or in cooking pits near campfires. Then, later in history, around the year 6000 BC, in what is now the area of southern China, people started gathering together in large groups, collecting shellfish like abalone, and then bringing them home to be eaten. This is believed to be some of the earliest evidence of human beings working together for a common goal. So it seems that abalones have been a part of human culture for a long time. But things really took off during the Han Dynasty, which lasted from 206 BC to 220 AD during the Han Dynasty. People were already farming abalones in ponds and tanks, mostly because they believed that eating them could cure illnesses like asthma. They also had a special festival dedicated to abalones, where farmers would dress up as hairy crabs, and people would catch them with their bare hands while laughing and drinking. In Japan, the history of abalone consumption dates back to 3000 BCE. It is mentioned in ancient texts, such as the Manushu, which is an anthology of Japanese poetry compiled in the early 8th century. In those days, Japanese emperors and nobles prized abalone as a luxury food, and it was often served as an offering to gods. The Chinese have a legend about abalones that goes back even further to the time of the legendary Emperor Jinmu, who supposedly used them to feed his 8 grandsons. In Korea, abalones have a similar status and are known as the king of seafood. During the Three Kingdoms period of Korea, which lasted from the 3rd to the 7th century, abalones were considered to be a sacred food and were only allowed to be eaten by the royal family. But as the centuries passed, the rules relaxed and abalones became more common among the general population. Nowadays, Korean abalone growers are some of the biggest exporters of edible abalone in the world. So, based on the evidence we have, it is clear that abalones have been part of human culture for thousands of years and were especially important in East Asia. And this is where things start to get interesting. As the demand for abalones grew over the centuries, people started looking for ways to farm them. The problem was that wild abalones were very hard to come by, and it was difficult to keep them alive in captivity. At first, the Chinese kept trying to farm them by throwing rocks into the water and making artificial reefs, hoping that the abalones would attach themselves to the rocks. But this didn't work well because other organisms like mussels would end up attaching to the rocks before the abalones did. Then someone came up with the idea of tying abalones to rocks instead. This worked much better, and soon people were selling abalones grown this way in street markets. But this method had its own problems. For example, predators would eat the abalones before they grew big enough, so people started putting nets over the rocks to protect the abalones from predators, and eventually they started putting the rocks in cages that were suspended in the water. This proved to be a very efficient way of farming abalones, but it still wasn't easy. Abalones needed to be fed, and the water had to be changed regularly. Plus, there were diseases that could wipe out the entire stock. Farmers tried feeding them algae and other plants, but nothing worked well. So abalones were still very expensive and getting more expensive every year. In the meantime, the Japanese had another solution. They built floating rafts in the water and put stones on top of the rafts. Then they would collect fresh seaweed every day and feed it to the abalones. This helped improve their growth rate and overall health. And since they had access to fresh seaweed every day, they didn't suffer from any nutritional deficiencies. This method is still being used today. However, this did not bring down the price of abalones. Instead, it made them even rarer and more expensive. In the United States, the demand for abalones started growing in the mid-19th century, when Chinese immigrants started coming to California. Many of these immigrants were from the Shandong province, where abalones were a staple of the diet. When they arrived in California, they found that there were no abalones there. So they started bringing them along with them when they traveled back to China. Pretty soon, San Francisco became the main entry point for abalones in the US, and many restaurants started serving them. When American soldiers returned home after fighting in the Pacific during World War II, many of them developed a taste for abalones, which were served in mess halls. After the war ended, many of these soldiers started looking for abalones in California, but they were out of luck. Turns out there were none, and then someone got the brilliant idea of harvesting the abalones that Chinese immigrants had brought to California. However, after harvesting, there weren't many abalones left, and the ones that were left weren't even the right species. This meant that the abalones that were brought to California were probably harvested in such large numbers that they almost completely disappeared. In fact, abalones were hunted so heavily that it led to the creation of laws protecting them. As a result of these efforts, abalones have slowly recovered in California. But they still have not reached the same abundance they once had. As it turned out, harvesting wild abalones is extremely difficult because they live in very harsh environments, and the season in which they are easiest to harvest lasts only for a few weeks. Not to mention that they are very slow growing. They don't reach maturity until they are 8 to 10 years old, and they only grow about 1 inch per year. So now let's try to answer the question, why are abalones so expensive? First of all, abalones are very difficult to harvest because they live in very harsh environments. They are found along rocky coastlines where they must contend with crashing waves, strong currents, and extreme temperatures. This means that only the toughest abalones survive, and that makes them harder to harvest. Plus, as I said earlier, abalones are very slow growing and don't reach maturity until they are 8 to 10 years old. This means that the supply of abalones is limited because it takes so long for them to grow. Another reason why abalones are expensive is because they are very labor-intensive to process. Once an abalone has been harvested, it must be cleaned, trimmed and sliced, which requires a lot of skill and experience. This is not something that machines can do yet, and it makes the cost of processing abalones very high. On top of that, abalones are a relatively new ingredient in many Western cuisines, and not everyone knows how to cook them. This means that there is a limited market for abalones, which keeps the price high. So as you can see, there are many reasons why abalones are so expensive. Their unique flavor and texture, their rarity, the difficulty of harvesting and processing them, and their relatively small market all contribute to their high price tag. Some people say that the high price of abalones is justified because they are such a delicious and nutritious food. They are a good source of protein and omega-3 fatty acids, and they have a unique chewy texture that is unlike any other food. Others argue that the high price of abalones is not justified because they are not very easy to prepare and they don't really have a unique flavor. What do you think? Are abalones worth their high price tag, or are they just a luxury item? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave us a like and subscribe if you want to learn about expensive things that are not for sale. Thank you for watching and see you next time.